draining lymph node during the time when we are already giving with the radiation therapy. This in turn results in the death of these T cells and hence decrease in the immunosuppression. However, when we give hypofractionated RT, there is more of the immunological cell death resulting in increase in T cell activation, reaching of these T cell activated T cell to the dendritic to the draining lymph nodes and the tumor, and by this time we have already completed with the radiation therapy, and therefore there is more of the tumor regression. Dose also matters. If we give hypofractionated RT like 8 gray into 3 fraction, 6 gray into 5 fraction, so there will be the activation of C-gastrin pathway resulting in increase in double-stranded DNA, which in turn results in dendritic cell activation by interferon beta pathway. However, if we give very high dose of radiation therapy like 20 gray single fraction, it will result in Tregs activation and in turn inhibition of the dendritic cells. So therefore, when we give 8 gray into 3 fraction or hypofractionated RT, it will be a more immunological effect. The same has been proved by different mouse models as well. With high dose of radiation therapy, there is decrease in double-stranded DNA and increased Tregs expressions. In the mouse model, they have also found that with radiation and anti-CTLA-4, when we give high dose of radiation therapy, there is less effect to the primary and the abscopal effect as compared to when we give hypofractionated RT. Now, is the site of radiation matters? Means whether we need to treat the parenchymal site or the brain or bone. So again, the studies have shown by the McCree et al. They have found that when we give radiation therapy to the parenchymal region, it will result in more of the immunological death as compared to treating bone and brain. Again, in another study by Coe et al. Published in JHAP, they have found that when we treat the primary site along with the metastatic site, there is more of the immunological effect resulting in improved overall survival, and here in the metastatic HCC patient, the 2 years overall survival reached up to 80%. Now, when to give immunocheckpoint inhibitor, whether before or after radiation therapy? So trials have found that one should give anti-CTLA-4 before giving SBRT because it will initiate post-immune response, whereas anti-PD-1 and anti-PD-L1 can be given concurrently or post-SBRT. However, if we give with concurrent, it will result in more of the adverse effects. So this is what I have told you in the last 5 or 7 minutes. With radiation therapy, there is increase in PD-1, CTLA-4. Therefore, we give anti-PD-1 and anti-CTLA-4 to inhibit this. And with radiation therapy, there is increase in the vascular endothelial growth factor, vascular abnormalities, and when we give anti-VEGF, it will promote normalization of the tumor vasculature and activation of the cytotoxic CD8 T cell, and therefore there is a synergistic effect in between the three. So, as I have already told that CTLA-4 act on the CTLA-4 receptor present on the T cell, and in turn activating this pathway. And similarly, the anti-PD-1 and PD-L1 act on the PD-1 and PD-L1 receptor present on the T cells and the tumor cells, and resulting in the tumor killing. Now, the combination of radiation therapy with TKI. So, studies have found that when we use radiation therapy along with TKI like envatinib, there is decrease in the tumor volume, vessel volume, and volume density of the vessels, showing that there is a synergistic effect when we use radiation along with the envatinib. Now, there are 2 clinical studies. RTOG 1112, when we use SBRT along with the sorafenib, there is an improvement in the median overall survival to 16 months as compared to 12 months. Whereas other studies with SBRT and TKI, all these studies have demonstrated an increase in the overall survival and progression-free survival. Nivolumab, when used concurrent or after SBRT, they have found that there is statistically significant improvement in the overall survival and PFS in this group of patients, irrespective of the timing. Nivolumab along with the anti-CTLA-4, that is ipilimumab, when has been used, it resulted in an improved overall survival. Median overall survival has reached up to 41 months. However, the toxicity in this group of patients is more than 72%. So So one should be cautious before using the combination of Nivo plus EP with SBRT. Now the triple therapy, that is SBRT with anti-PD-1 or PD-L1 along with the TKI. So these studies by Ma et al. And the second study by the Heng et al., they have shown that there is doubling of median overall survival to 16 months and 30 months respectively in the two studies when we have used the combination therapy in this group of patients. SAT study is the one which we have conducted in our institution and is again is presented yesterday at ASLD in Washington, and we have found that SBRT when used along with the AT plus BEV as compared to AT plus BEV alone, the median overall survival is 15 months as compared to 12 months. So there are a few patients that we have treated SBRT followed by TKI in this large tumor, young chap. Reduction is given followed by good partial response at the primary side, and the patient underwent hepatectomy in 22. Further, this is a follow-up scan of September 25. Another infiltrating HCC, large HCC, treated by SBRT, followed by immunocheckpoint inhibitor, A plus B, and this is a 3.5 years post follow-up. SBRT along with immunotherapy can be used as a procedure for downstaging before DDLT. Another patient which we have treated by SBRT followed by DDLT. This is a here in this case we have re-challenged with SBRT. So in this lady we have given radiation therapy to the primary side. However, the radiation was not given to a very high dose because remaining liver volume was hardly 600 cc. So we have treated in 8 fractions by radiation therapy given cabozantinib. During the follow-up, initially responded, then there is increase in the alpha-fetoprotein and the PIVKA, and therefore patient was started on A plus B. Again, patient received 6 cycles of chemotherapy, and there is again increase in the alpha-fetoprotein and PIVKA. This time we have re-challenged with radiation therapy. Earlier also the radiation dose was not given to a curative intent because of the remaining liver volume. This time what we have found that the new recurrence occur in the area where the spillage of the tumor dose was less than 15 gray. So we have treated only the part that was not treated, that has not received 15 gray volume in the earlier radiation therapy timing. So this time we have treated this area by 20 gray in 5 fractions, and again re-challenge with A plus B. So again it is 10 months post re-challenge with SBRT and A plus B, and patient is doing it well as of now. So the take-home message, SCC is a heterogeneous disease with heterogeneous TME, consists of both immunomodulatory and immunosuppressive components. Triple therapy tends to modulate the tumor microenvironment, resulting to improve anti-tumor effects with manageable side effects. More comparative trials are required to fully understand the implication of the combination as well as timing and sequencing of the treatment. So at the last we can say SBRT is a ray of hope for the liver cancers. Thank you. But if we talk about the number of the lesion, if there are multifocal disease in one lobe of the lesion, we can treat. So we have to take care of the remaining liver volume. If the remaining liver volume is around 600, 700, as per the guidelines it is 700 cc. But with low dose of radiation therapy, we can treat up to 550 or 600 cc as well, where we can treat at 25 gray in 5 fraction or 20 gray in 5 fraction for an immunomodulation. So our intent also matters, with what intent we are going to treat.
Here again is the role of brachytherapy in palliative treatment for liver cancer.
Treating the patient of HCC depends on the size of the lesion, number of the lesion, location of the tumor, and the viscoelasticity. So depending on the size, if the size is small, then we can easily target the tumor with brachytherapy. Then the brachytherapy versus RFA or microwave is the option. Then either can be done.
At your center, are you doing this?
No, sir, we are not doing brachytherapy because we have a full-fledged IR department where they are treating the tumors by microwave, RFA, electroporation, and TACE and TR.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker for the in this session is Dr. Lincoln Pujari, and topic is the bladder.
Cystectomy is the standard of care as of now for MIBC, that is muscle invasive bladder cancer. So around 25 to 30% patients present with this MIBC at their presentation, and the outcome of radical cystectomy is the overall survival is around 63% when we combine both non-muscle invasive and muscle invasive, but it decreases to around 47% with MIBC. But there are some inherent problems with this radical cystectomy, such as poorer quality of life, perioperative or postoperative complications, and most of the time the patients are not eligible for radical cystectomy only because of it's a disease of the elderly. So, coming to the bladder preservation strategies, which is usually called as tri-modality therapy, because we have to combine different specialties in achieving the optimal outcomes for these patients. So it includes optimal transurethral resection of the bladder tumor. Apart from that, the most important part is played by this radiotherapy, that is radical radiotherapy, and suitably supported by addition of concurrent chemotherapy. So how have we reached to this point? So the evidences for this trimodality therapy has come from different trials. There was a pooled analysis from the RTOJ. They have included 6 trials. So among them, only one trial was phase 3, but they have included trials including from phase 1 to phase 3 and included over 500 patients. And they analyzed and told that yes, the trimodality therapy with the addition of chemotherapy and radiation therapy can achieve also a reasonable amount of control. So in this study, the median age was around 66 years. Most of the patients were either T2 or T3. The complete response rate, as you can see, was pretty high, that is 69%. And only 20% of patients needed radical cystectomy after completion of their trimodality therapy. So as you can see, whatever was the outcome at around 5 years, the results were pretty sustained and the disease was ably controlled at around 10 years as well. The muscle invasive local failure was from 13% to 14% over a period of 10 years. Similarly, distant metastasis rate was also below 35%. Now, how did we come to add concurrent chemotherapy into this radiotherapy protocol? This was proved by BC 2001, and the use of some of the radiation sensitizer was used in BC-ON trial. So they showed that chemo or cisplatin-free chemotherapy, they used 5-FU and mitomycin C, and this was cisplatin-free because most of these patients were elderly and most of them could be cisplatin ineligible. So even if the patient is cisplatin ineligible, we can offer bladder preservation strategy for these patients as well. So median age was 72 years. Complete TURBT was achieved in only 56%. So this was a major drawback in this trial. The TURBT was not optimal, we could say. And T2 patients were 83%. The primary endpoint they looked at was locoregional disease-free survival. So as we can see, the locoregional disease-free survival at 2 years was 67% with CTRT and only 54% with radiotherapy. Similarly, there was a significant increase in invasive locoregional disease-free survival as well. So, coming to the overall survival, there was a separation of the curves after 2 years, but this was not statistically significant. However, the 5-year overall survival was 48% with CTRT arm and 35% in the RT arm. So, this trial first basically established the role of concurrent chemotherapy in the bladder preservation strategies in the form of TNT. Now coming to a large retrospective study, the Massachusetts General Hospital has got a very good experience or robust experience in using this bladder preservation strategies since the very beginning. So they have analyzed their patients' data from 1986 to 2013, including 475 patients, included all patient subtypes which were mostly node negative, Complete response rate in those cohort was 75%, which is a pretty high number. And the risk of salvage cystectomy, as we can see, at 5 years was only 30%, and at 10 years was 31%. That means that after 10 years, around 70% of the patients treated with this bladder preservation strategy could preserve their bladder. So, coming to the disease-specific survival and overall survival, as we can see, the disease-specific survival ranged from around 59 to 56% at 10 to 15 years, and intact bladder disease-specific survival was around 46 to 40% at a time point of 10 to 15 years. Similar is there is good outcome for overall survival as well. Now, this is an interesting part of this publication, which shows that over a period of time, they divide all the patients into around 5 years of time period, and they have clearly shown that as you grow with experience, your outcomes with bladder preservation therapies increase pretty much. Like as you can see, the red line is the latest, that is the 2005 to 2013 cohort of patients. So as you can see, there is a improvement in overall survival, disease-specific survival, and bladder intact disease-specific free survival as well in these patients. So this could be due to improvement in the better patient selection, better techniques of radiotherapy, and obviously the use of concurrent chemotherapy in these patients. Similarly, the crude rate of cystectomy also shows a pretty steady decrease in the rates, as from the high of around 40% in the cohort of 86 to 95 in the year 85 to 95, it decreases to less than 15% in the cohort of patients who were treated between 2005 to 2013. So it shows that it has got a bit of learning curve, but it is achievable. And with the modern therapies, modern techniques, and modern systemic therapies, this is also achievable quite very well. Now, they have also shown the importance of having a complete TURBT prior to this concurrent chemoradiotherapy. Here in this pooled analysis of MGH as well as the RTOG. Similarly, there is improvement in the 5-year overall survival and decrease in the rate of need of salvage radical cystectomy after concurrent chemoradiotherapy as well, if you have got complete TURBT upfront. Now, there is no direct comparison of the radical cystectomy vis-a-vis this bladder preservation strategy, but we have seen many of these retrospective studies and other systemic reviews and large database analysis of retrospective data. They have shown pretty comparative results. Most of them are in overall survival terms non-significant differences, but we must keep in mind most of the patients who were treated with radical radiotherapy or radical chemoradiotherapy were patients who were having poor OS, higher stage of disease, and who could not undergo radical cystectomy for their treatment. So they were inherently poor risk category patients, and in those patients as well, the concurrent chemoradiotherapy has achieved a reasonably good outcome in these patients. So now there is a doubt among surgeons that even if the salvage cystectomy after concurrent chemoradiotherapy is going to be a bit difficult in these patients, but data says otherwise. Like in this analysis, as we can see, the primary surgery was 426 patients and salvage surgery was in 420 patients. When they compared, they didn't show much of a difference between the 30-day modality, 60-day modality, or 90-day modality among these two subgroup of patients. So with the salvage surgery also, the 90-day mortality was in the tune of only 4.7%, which was with primary surgery 3.8%. So it is doable. The basic thing is even salvage cystectomy is doable. Just it has got a learning curve for that, and you need to gain experience in this. So these cases should be taken up in specialized centers who have got good experience in dealing with these patients. So overall, it's not about whether we should go with surgery or radiation. It's about combining all these modalities, whichever are available with us, to get the best possible outcome for the patients. So, as we all know, patients having large tumor sizes more than 5 centimeter, multifocal disease, locally advanced most of the time, presence of hydronephrosis, which is a relative contraindication probably, and multifocal or concomitant carcinoma in situ. These patients are not really suitable for bladder preservation strategies. All other can be considered, and obviously these patients can be also considered. These are kind of not no-go areas. These are relative contraindications in these patients. Now, these are the two main types of TMT approaches which we use these days. The first one is the split course, which is mostly the American type of protocol, where you give around 40 to 45 gray of radiation upfront, then you assess with a cystoscopy. If you have some residual disease, then you go ahead with the radical cystectomy, and if you have complete response, then you consolidate with additional doses of radiation to these patients. But as compared to this, the continuous courses that you upfront in the very first go give the total doses up to 55 gray if you are using hypofractionated treatment, and up to 64-66 gray if you are using conventional fractionation treatment. This continuous course of treatment leaves a better scope of bladder preservation in these patients. So that has to be kept in mind. Apart from that, with TMT, the quality of life of the patient is obviously better because the bladder is preserved. The patient doesn't need to carry a stoma throughout his life. And there is a fear amongst the oncologists and radiation oncologists also that the irradiated bladder is not going to function well. But in most of the cases, as we can see from these papers, around 75% of the patients who have been treated with TMT have normal urodynamic studies during their lifetime. So it's doable and the quality of life is well preserved. Let all be sure about it. Now, coming to this, there are a few limitations with MIBC as well. The recurrence rate in the tune of around 20% even after complete response rate, and orthotopic neobladder, the making of this orthotopic neobladder will be a bit difficult because you have already irradiated some of the bowel in the vicinity while giving the first radiation itself. And there will always be a staging ambiguity because, as we all know, the surgical staging is the gold standard for staging purposes in these patients. So, what next? There is a big way that the use of NACT has come with the use of radical cystectomy. But how it goes with our radical radiotherapy? So this is a phase 3 trial from the MRC group, pretty old, 2011. Here, what they did was that they gave first included MIBC patient, mostly T2 grade 3, T3 and T4 N0 patients. They used NACT followed by some kind of radical treatment for the bladder. It could be either cystectomy or radical radiotherapy. And in the other run, it was only just the radical treatment. They included 403 patients, and after a median follow-up of around 8 years, they published their data. So what do we see? This is out of the 800 patients, around 400 patients were treated with radical radiotherapy. Inherently, they were of the poor risk group. They had lower PS, higher age at presentation, and most of them were of higher T stage as well. Still, we can see that in overall survival terms, the hazard ratio of 0.8 when you use CMV, that is cisplatin, methotrexate and vinblastine based chemotherapy in the neoadjuvant setting. Though it's not statistically significant, but I believe that if it would have, the study was not powered to assess that from the very beginning. If adequate patient numbers can be accrued to this trial, probably this trial also could have been positive, because as we can see, the confidence interval is only 1.0 to the upper margin. So it's like that. So basically, NACT with radical radiotherapy or radical concurrent chemoradiotherapy may also work in these patients. Let's keep that in mind. Few of the retrospective studies also have proven that, but this was a major phase 3 trial supporting this idea. Now with the advent of immunotherapy, it's coming in a big way, and it is also being introduced in the bladder preservation strategy. Many of these trials are being running. The atezolizumab has already has gone into a phase 3 trial in this setting. So we are eagerly waiting for these results, and probably this is the future when we will be using immunotherapy along with the radiotherapy for these patients for bladder preservation strategies. There is another idea of tetramodality therapy, where after use of this concurrent radiotherapy, concurrent chemoradiotherapy, you evaluate a response. And if there is some residual disease, or even there is no residual disease, you can just offer a partial cystectomy for these patients and take out the primary tumor areas. So this might give a better results. This was a small study which has shown that 5-year disease-specific survival reaching up to 83% and 5-year overall survival reaching up to 77% with this tetramodality therapy approach as well. So, for the house, I believe that the radical cystectomy still is the gold standard, as we all know, but bladder preservation protocols can give similar outcomes in suitably selected patients. And patient-centric discussion with multidisciplinary team approach, what everybody can put on the table becomes the key, and the patient should be the master of all the choices. Thank you. Thank you.
Any question? From back seat?
It's very nice.
Front seat?
Patients who were treated for MIBC with trimodality therapy, and on cytology, urine cytology, there was some carcinoma cells seen, and they were evaluated. They came out to be non-muscle invasive recurrence. So they were kept on BCG as well. Though the tolerance of BCG becomes questionable in these patients, but few patients preserved their bladder on BCG for quite a few years, like 2 to 3 years I have seen one patient. So these are anecdotal, but still, this is also a possibility. The bladder can be preserved.
Sir, very good argument. But only hitch is here. You are comparing radical cystectomy. Of course, I am a medical oncologist. I am in between radiation and surgery. Comparing radical cystectomy, single modality with trimodality here. Is that true?
Yes.
Ask a surgeon to give him immunotherapy, chemotherapy, followed by radical cystectomy. Then you call it a day. Without comparison that a single modality versus trimodality. Any surgeons in the hall?
Sir, may
Their opinion.
I come in, sir? Sir, it's not exactly only single modality, because these days radical cystectomy is supplemented with neoadjuvant chemotherapy in most of the cases, because it has become standard of care. Firstly, and secondly, there is an option of even immunotherapy in adjuvant setting after radical cystectomy in these patients. So this was not the case with radical radiotherapy or radical chemoradiotherapy. To this date, there is no robust data and there is no guideline to use NACT with radical chemoradiotherapy. Whenever we use that, we use it upfront, and probably it's true that we are using all three modalities, but the bigger picture is that we are saving the bladder. That is the most important thing, with good functionality as well. As I have already shown, 75% of the treated bladder has preserved these aerodynamic functions. So that's a point to see, sir. I would submit that.
The option is between surgical and non-surgical. Are you going to save the organ or not? At the first instance.
So the world is moving towards organ preservation.
Yeah. And that increases the importance of the modality.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you all.
On the stage, Dr. Dr. V.K. Misra sir, and organizing chairperson Dr. A.K. Chaturvedi sir for the facilitation of this.
So always in tumor board we are 2 by 1, but now in colorectal cancers, now we are trying to both modalities where we are doing extending our surgical extent like sphincter preservation and more advanced of surgeries by the all minimal invasive as well as robotic methods, and also now another modality that we are trying to go for the organ preservation, though very nascent stage, but it is going to be boon for those patients where we are going for the APR particularly. So in these all new changes, let's have a little bit discussion about the case. So I will have just one case and we will proceed slowly with that case discussion. If you see the data in Indian setup also, the colorectal cancer always come in top 5. In US and Western world, it is the one of the top 3 cancers, and global the mortality is 10% of cancers in colorectal cases. And obviously genetic factors are there, but hardly 5% of patients who have the familial history of adenomatous polyposis coli or non-hereditary polyposis coli. And in our setting, if you see the India, the both in the male and female, if you cite the male, they are 4th most common, and in the female it is the 5th most common cancers, and nearly 70,000 cases are detected per year in our country. So in this view, I am just going to have a brief profile about a patient. She is a 30-year-old female, newly diagnosed rectal carcinoma. So this patient was presented us with a symptom of on and off rectal bleeding for 3 months and on and off abdominal pain for 2 months. So I want to ask our panelists that what you think in any young age patient when they are coming with such kind of vague symptoms, just 1 or 2 episodes of PR history. So what is your insight to further work up these patients?
We'll go for a colonoscopy first. And if there is a mass in the colonoscopy or sigmoidoscopy or proctoscopy.
So normally in routine patients, you prefer to do colonoscopy first invasive procedure, or you want to go with some less mild procedure, particularly in Indian country where they can have hemorrhoids and all these DTs. So what really comes in your mind such kind of patients? Because normally as a surgeon, because there is nobody in panel surgeons, but for surgeons perspective, invasive procedure we always take for a little later.
We don't know now the bleeding is from the rectal side or from the colon.
Yeah.
So that's why to localize the site of bleeding we need to first investigate.
So anyone in house, what you prefer to go?
Why don't we start with rectal examination first? Why don't
Yeah.
we start it with that? I believe that is more sensible, and when you talk about on and off rectal bleeding, you may think of hemorrhoids as the first differentials, which I believe is much more sensible to talk. But as I look to your history, you've already told that it is a mid disease performing adenocarcinoma. So I would rather prefer DRG.
So yeah, so one good message that panel is giving that in any case patient, whether it is coming to our OPD, being oncologist, we always just jump to the oncological diagnosis. So benign cases we may get, and in most of the cases, the classical theorem that in medical science we have, the detailed examination, detailed history, they are going to give you the clues from where we can have other investigation in further process. So in this patient, the personal history, there was no comorbidity, patient was non-smoker, non-tobacco chewer, and no other addiction. So what trend normally we find in particularly female patient in rural areas, most of our residents are hesitant to ask them whether they are tobacco chewer or alcoholic or not. But being a female, for the young bloods, always ask, they can be alcoholic, they can be tobacco chewer, so your associated factor can be there. So see, patient is married, para-1 L1 menstrual cycle were regular, there was no significant history in this patient, and there was no known risk factors. So, Neha sir, what kind of risk factor you prefer to evaluate in a patient, when, particularly young patient, when you are suspecting that they may be a colorectal cancer patient?
The routine factors like smoking and alcohol. In addition, probably I would like to add on the infective, HIV status. probably that may be one of the risk factors for this, I suppose.
Okay, sir. So, anyone else?
So, obesity, smoking, and prior pelvic radiation. Obviously, we should take a history of prior any treatment to the patient for whatever the reason. Other than the rectal carcinoma, though the genetic is very less, but it is there. So maybe the Lynch syndrome and some familial adenomatous polyposis syndrome, history of polyp or previous bleeding in past is also a significant risk factor for colon malignancy to develop.
Yeah. So nearly 5% of colorectal cancer are associated with genetic cancers, and many times patient may tell you history that they have history of previous colonoscopies, because maybe somebody has done, and they had few cases we had got where they had reported polyps in their past also. So in the risk factor, when we are concluding, obviously we have to think that it is because colonic cancers are adenoma carcinoma sequence. So there is polyp formations are very much common there, particularly sessile polyp that we miss on colonoscopy. So this patient has no particularly known risk factor. On the physical examination, we have done per-abdominal, there was no finding. In the proctoscopy, there was no finding, and PR, no palpable growth. So all the basic workup we can do in colorectal cancer patient in just OBD basis. So normally you have to put your finger first to figure out whether the mass. If there is any surgical oncologist, what is the preference if we are doing a PR? What we are looking for? What as a clinician you look for in a PR in a colorectal cancer patient? You are the radiation oncologist. What is it is going to help you?
I think we should be looking at the anal tone and the sphincter at the same time. So you should even look at the clockwise, where is the growth which has been happening, does it bleed on touch or not, and is there any additional features, like as I said, there can be additional polyp or hemorrhoids, or there is a single growth, and apart from that, probably these are the major findings, I believe, in an rectal examination.
So does this physical finding, particularly PR length from an verge, the distance or location, is going to help you out in your radiation planning in some way, or you are particularly rely on your radiological imaging only?
I believe when you are looking at a PR finding, you may not be able to go to the posterior aspect. The growth may be so much that you might not be able to go to the posterior aspect. So you will require an imaging in a way. Either in the obviously I will subject my patient not just to proctoscopy, because the length of the proctoscopy is very small. You may have a growth which is extending upwards. Why don't you go with colonoscopy or sometimes it's with microscopy? And definitely you have to go for an imaging. And preferable imaging, it depends, like howsoever is there. If you are at a very good center, you can add MRI to what is known as PET CT, or if it is not affordable in that case, you ask the patient to get a CT done in that kind of scenarios.
Okay.
You need to have some imaging.
Yeah. So one other thing that as a surgical persons we take in consideration whenever we are going to do PR examination or thing, we particularly want to see the groin area, because in this territory fungal infection is very common. So you have to look after with surgical planning that you should not land up in those situations. And I think, is there any kind of contraindication with fungal or local inflammatory condition for your radiation? I'm not aware of that.
So for gross tumor delineation also, we need the craniopodal extent of the disease and the distance from the anal verge.
Yeah.
So with our PR findings, we can correlate with the radiological image or the proctoscopy or colonoscopy findings. And then if we are not able to palpate till the upper extent of the disease, then we can rely on the colonoscopy findings.
Yeah. So in this patient, we could not get any palpable growth. So near about it can give you a kind of picture that obviously the growth somewhere not in lower rectum.
If I may can add a point, because you said she's 30 years, very young female. Obviously, the menstrual history was very important in this case, and you may even subject the patient to UPT if needed, depending on if it's needed. And I believe it is very much important in such cases.
So this patient has menstrual regular. Obviously, we have to have the LMP dates also. So, what the biochemistry you want to prefer in these setups, in these kind of patients?
upon the patient's routine examination that you have mentioned that obviously you need additional echo-coagulation profile because you need to see how the bleeding happening. Definitely, besides that, you have serum tumor markers that you have seen slightly raised in this case. We take it around 2.5 to 5, sometimes or 2.5 below, but here it is 1.2, which is literally alarming. But again, it can be two causes. It can be physiological or pathological. So apart from that, you have to see.
Any other tumor marker you want to see?
So first thing, before biopsy diagnosis, I will not do tumor marker. First thing. I don't prefer tumor marker upfront because it's not a diagnostic thing, it's a prognostic thing. Why to jump upon tumor markers directly without any biopsy proof? Obviously, later on you can have an idea. Now better biomarkers like ctDNA is also coming and we are doing in the upfront patient and follow the patient on the basis of ctDNA also, liquid biopsy. Second thing is, I will prefer the full length colonoscopy also before going to the final treatment. Because in any rectal malignancy or colon malignancy, full length colonoscopy should be done. Because otherwise, skip lesions has been seen somewhere.
So, patient got after proper bowel preparation colonoscopy done, and what is your preference if a patient has, because this patient has 4 centimeter growth and it was not actually occluding the lumen. But in cases if you have a lumen occlusion, what is your preference to have the colonoscopy? You want intra-op colonoscopy or you people prefer to colonoscopy after completion of your upfront treatment?
We need a colonoscopy. Luminal occlusion will be there, but then the gastrosurgeon will tell how much pass the colonoscope has been passed. You can tell that, and it is always advisable to have a imaging also with respect to colonoscopy, and obviously you need a post also because you need to differentiate it at the same time.
So many times the problem comes to us because in mid-rectum patient locally advanced, they are not coming upfront for surgery to us. And obviously we had not evaluated colon because we could not pass the scope. So in these cases, obviously the lower portion, because when you are doing a neoadjuvant chemo-RT, you are just treating the up to the pelvis, mostly upper colon is free for us. So when we do operate, we do intra-op colonoscopy that time only to figure it out whether we not escaping any other lesion, because most of these lesions are spared from radiation, but these lesions may have exposed the chemo already. So it becomes little difficult in those situations to figure it out whether you are not escaping any lesion.
And I believe you will have well equipped with intra-op colonoscopy available to you.
So, Dr. Alok, do you replace sometimes CT enterography?
We do. But again, sessile polyps or all these things you may miss on CT enterography. So colonoscopy is much better test, but obviously there is some logistic issues comes to us. Then we most of the time rely on our radiological diagnosis only, that what the CT scan is seeing like enterography or MRI or something.
I think most of the surgical oncologists are doing intra-op colonoscopy.
Most of the time we do. So the patient has 4 centimeter size lesion from the anal verge, and it was mid-rectal, and biopsy was adenocarcinoma, moderate differentiated. So now the question is that you will prefer to do colonoscopy first or you will prefer to have imaging first? In real world, what we do, I just want to listen.
Once we suspect malignancy, probably colonoscopy has a role upfront. Later on comes the staging procedure. So once we have to establish the diagnosis, then comes to the staging.
Yeah. So sir, standard of care is obviously imaging should be secondary, but in these territories where practically the gastroenterologists are not available that much, so most of the surgeons are doing what practically, they go with a bleeding patient, they do PR, they do DRE, they are not finding any mass, they go for the CT scan first. They want to figure it out, or simple ultrasound to get there is any mass or not. So what is modality you are going to choose for the staging workup in these patients? Either ultrasound or CT or MRI or PET?
Once it's confirmed by colonoscopy, it's CT. CT is the minimum essential thing.
Okay.
Ultrasound may not give a clear picture, as we are thinking of the satellite lesions or the skip lesions. Most of the times they are.
But the mesorectal fascia involvement is better seen on the MRI.
So
it is essential for the.
So the answer here comes diagnosed colonoscopy that it is a rectum. Obviously, we have to go for the MRI. If in the colon,
No, in my view, if it's a case for surgeon, probably I would opt for MRI. If it is not a case, that means in an advanced stage, let us say someone wrote somewhere I felt, probably I will get away.
But sir, in that case also we prefer to have MRI because you have to know the CRM, whether because we need CRM information before surgery. So when I am going to operate that patient, when you are going to do TME, then you have to have that knowledge that what was CRM that time, what was the lymph nodal stages at that time. So now in MRI, if more than 7 mm is there, then obviously we take it as the N1 nodes. So mostly we prefer to have the MRI. Now the question from MRI pelvis only, or you want to go with MRI whole abdomen?
So my practice in last 9 or 10 years, I do whole abdomen because I have an added advantage of to see the liver also. And I have seen the cases where liver mets are missed on the PET CT and CT scan both. So rectal malignancy has very high propensity to get a liver mets, though they are manageable right now even in oligometastatic setting also. But at least we should prefer, if possible, we should go for a whole MRI abdomen.
Yeah. So one good thing is that gold standard is MRI whole abdomen. The only constant that comes to resource limited areas is cost. So if patient is affordable, cost is not limitation. We prefer to have whole MRI whole abdomen. Along with the choice comes for the other staging workup, that whether how you are going to stage the chest. You want to. So how many of you in clinical practice is choosing just chest X-ray, not the CT scan?
Well, you yourself said, or what is known as chest X-ray. If you are not resource limited, patient is affordable, you can go for HRCT. Right? Obviously, they are resource limited. You can even do just USG abdomen. That will also tell you what the liver position.
So
that's the point in that MRI abdomen. If you are getting the modality done, get it done fully.
So now what? There is one more thing that we ask patient to save the money to have the CCT chest, along with they get the upper cut of abdomen and then rest pelvic MRI. So this decrease your cost in practicality, and most of the patient manage in the price of whole abdomen MRI.
I think MRI abdomen has one important role in seeing the omental caking also. If there is omental.
It is there, but see when omental caking is present, then obviously that domain is going out of our.
But like we are in the staging workup phase, so MRI abdomen.
So if you see the omental caking issue, then we prefer the PET scan. Reason is that because now we are doing hypectomy colorectal also. So for us, then PCI matter. Peritoneal carcinomatosis index matters, and there if we find that thing. So in practical world, we calculate better with PET scan than with any MRI.
So positive predictive value of MRI for detecting smaller liver sores is far better than PET CT. PET CT as well. Now PET CT sometimes fails. That's why in those cases we should prefer MRI.
When if you do FDG PET, later on there is always a radiological correlation with the USG, or they can ask for an MRI like
so that is the reason we don't do FDG PET only. We do PET CT.
Yes.
So when you are doing CT, you are getting that radiological correlation already there. So in Western world, there is a two things are different because nuclear medicine report PET and the radiologist report CT part. In India, somehow we have got enough.
I agree to what you say.
Yeah, so there are PET CTs more commonly we are doing, not only PET only. So, but
when do you order PET CT after seeing the things? When do you prefer to do the PET CT in your scenario?
Yeah, so normally if the heavy disease load is there, then we prefer, if we are finding that tumor is completely fixed or we are suspecting some peritoneal metastasis, I told you that for that we prefer to have PET scan because in that single, most of the cases are not going to be operable for us. So only one possibility we want to rule out, whether it is only intraperitoneal spread or extraperitoneal spread, whether its lung is involved or not. Even now in lung mets, if oligometastatic disease, lung is involved, still we treat in later stage to those also. So PET scan somewhere give us both metabolic response in future as well as we give the anatomical detail. So what we do here that we ask our nuclear guy to do PET scan with diagnostic CT scan, because when they are doing simple PET CT, normally they put the contrast in less amount. So that's the both purpose we get resolved that way. PET CT with the diagnostic doses of the contrast give you a proper diagnostic CT.
Also, if there is high nodal burden in the MRI itself, then it for the next investigation you should go for a PET scan.
PET scan. But gold standard for T staging for nodal metastasis or mesorectal fascia, particularly for surgeons, it is MRI. Good contrast enhanced MRI is going to give us all the required details that we want. Anybody is preferring endoscopic ultrasound?
If possible, we should do. If not possible, we should not do. But yes, better modality for T staging, I think, more than MRI.
But T1 and T2 only.
Yeah.
So when you are going to for the MRI and particularly you are discussing for CRM, then it is modality has less specificity. When 1 and 2 when you are differentiating, then obviously that is good enough. But I think T3, T4 MRI is good enough. That is giving us more detail. So this is the correct correlation that if you see the higher sensitivity versus CT in T staging MRI have. So that's why for us gold standard is MRI only. So whenever you are evaluating a rectal case, then it is preferable that order for the contrast enhanced MRI pelvis. It is going to be helpful for both of us.
One point I want to mention
Yes, sir.
is that whatever you are saying us was true. For original taking, CT is better. And for imminent ultrasound, it is quite a good modality and is being used. So whatever you have said earlier, that we will do chest with upper abdomen, that will detect the umbilical taking earlier. Then MRI abdomen will be there. So whatever you were saying earlier was better.
Yes, sir. Thank you. So this was exact MRI, and both the T1 and T2 imaging, you can say the mass is nearly mid-rectal phase. And if you see there, so small nodes are there, but they are not very big enough that we can clearly say. So in this particular case, it was mainly 8 to 9 mm nodes, and because we stage always these patients as T3N1 for our MRI finding. So I will just discuss after that. In this case, patient insisted us to have the PET scan also. So normally we don't routinely do, but if patient wants, then we normally get it done. And the same correlation was came into that too, T3 and
I think in MRI you have mentioned extramural invasion also.
Yeah.
That is also an indication.
Indication for, yeah.
You should do in that case.
So now there is one thing that gradually in MRI and histopathology we are preferring to get reported, that is your extramural venous invasion that you were saying. So obviously MRI is more sensitive for extramural venous invasion than the PET scan or any other modality. And it is a poor prognostic factor. So if you are knowing EMBI beforehand, then obviously you can prognosticate patient in a better way. So MBI is basically when the tumor is, you are seeing inside the blood vessels of the tumor beyond the muscularis propria. So now this is a comparative study that we are discussing about PET or MRI, when and what we have to prefer. So obviously you see that when local staging you want, there is no requirement for the PET scan at all. In most of those parameters, our MRI is better than PET scan. And always choose contrast enhanced MRI, because plain MRI is not going to give you that much detail. So do you think that MRI is required for your planning upfront MRI, or it's not required for all of you?
In all cases, but yes, it can help us like delineate the tumor well, and it can actually see as the nodal, but it can also be seen on the CT scans. But sometimes we do use it. But then, if, as you said, if the risk factors are present and you have another, we will be preferring PIT CT mode. That is a more, it is being used to delineate the tumors at the same time.
So the final diagnosis was T3N1 moderate differentiate adenocarcinoma. So now, Dr. Saurabh, what will be your preference? How you will proceed with this patient?
So it's T3N1 and patient is symptomatic only for the bleeding, no obstructive symptoms, nothing. So definitely in that case we need a MDT discussion that how to plan a treatment, because it will be a longer treatment, and tri-modality treatment we should all prefer. And the question is that where we should put all the treatment. So I think current era is moving towards the neoadjuvant therapy first, in the form of chemotherapy and radiation therapy, and what is the sequence and way, that is a tumor board discussion and logistics and everything, followed by surgical diagnosis in locally advanced setting. So patient is having any obstructive symptoms sometime and definitely not manageable to the initial radiation or chemo part, definitely surgical or colostomy, diversion and everything can be planned. So that's how we grossly plan, and then fine tuning of the treatment happens for further discussion.
So Dr. Kamboj, one thing I want, do you want to have some role of surgeon in this particular case before going for your planning?
Colonoscopy from their end. Just a colonoscopy from their end, and if the obstructive symptoms are there, we will ask for the colonoscopy.
Okay. Anyone else thinks that surgeon may be a little bit helpful?
So I need surgeon for counseling.
Yeah. So one thing is, this is locally advanced cancer. So the T3, T4 and any N1 disease and positive is locally advanced. And in locally advanced cancers, obviously, we are going to have the multimodality management where everyone is involved. But particularly these young patients, and they are fit, they may want to have further kids, they may want to have something in their family or hormonal preservation. So what is your opinion about in these patients, particularly fertility preservation or ovarian transpositions if required?
Must. 30 years, young female must. I mean, you have already focused this over here, and I think the counseling is very much important. And from our point of view, we should always like us, and we should always counsel them that you should go if you have not completed the family is not complete, these are the options available. You can even direct them to the counselors, you can direct them to the infertility clinics or the fertility clinics or whatever mapping you have, and you should give them the option of preservation in any form, either like oocyte or the cryopreservation, whatever.
So ovarian transposition, I can ask surgeon to do a ovarian transposition.
But how often and how routinely you ask that?
Like very little.
So I think we are not having that in practice because most of the time we don't encounter such young patients in our daily practice also. But obviously counseling has very important role in these particular young patients because they have long life to live, and every type of toxicity, whether it is surgical comorbidities we are creating, your chemotherapies or radiation comorbidities, they are going to have certain long-lasting effect on them. So we should counsel them, and taking their mind and their expectation towards the future life is very important in these cases. One thing I want to ask you, sir, post-radiation, how much endometrium damage? So suppose ovarian function we have preserved, we have done transposition. Do their patients are going to conceive normally, or they have to go for IVF or surrogacy? What is your routine practice? Do you have a witness any real-time patient post-RT who had got pregnant?
Like totally tell you about the percentage is very less, because itself those techniques, in vitro fertilization or the preservation techniques itself, they have the outcomes are very poor. Even that the 40 to 50% they actually turn out to be in actual happening over there. And maybe you are more compliant with respect to the answer to this.
My take is that wherever the radiation or chemo have more effect, where there are more stem cells or some rapidly dividing cells. So in uterus lining, basically it's every month there is a menstruation phase and everything, but there is no such any stem cell or something. So not a much damage from the radiation therapy or chemotherapy even on the uterine lining, what you are concerned. Very rare anything directly hitting the uterus, and that will become an obscure, you can say obstacle for the pregnancy. But ovary wise, but one question is also to radiation oncology, I have always that. How much they think that radiation is going to affect the ovary actually. It's a permanent sterility if you don't avoid, if you don't transposition, or is there any chance still to have a ovarian reserve even after the radiation also? Because with the chemotherapy it's less than 2%, what I have my data, but for the radiation therapy I don't know. So I think...
So the literature says almost all the cases cannot be preserved, the fertility cannot be preserved. Because the constraints of ovary, as if you see from a radiation oncology perspective, the constraints are very less. It's 1 or 2. So if it is inside the film, it would be very, very difficult to preserve the ovarian function.
Actually, what happens? The tolerance of uterus is very much. It is around 21,000 net. So tolerance of uterus is too much, and the ovaries are situated far away from the uterus. So, and that is my point of view, that it is not, ovary is not centrally located. So you have to see where ovary is. Position is quite very good. So it may be out of your field also, and you can shift also. There is no problem with that.
I think sir is correct, but I think if it is in the field, because when you're treating the pelvic nodal burden over there, obviously the ovaries will be somewhere around there only, and slightly different with the respect.
Advise them or counsel them for these things. So now we're coming to the basic, our age-old NCCM, the guiding pillar for us. Now how you will approach? Do you think that you need more information in your biopsy report before treating the patient, or that report of moderate differential adenocarcinoma was good enough for your further course of action?
So yes, means apart from classical histopathological findings, whatever the LVI and other things, we have to go for the molecular also, because in current era, MSI status definitely to be known, and in both in the form of germline and somatic both. Tumor testing as well as germline testing should be done for MMR testing, that is MSI. And for that PIK3CA just came now that you can have, that you should done, and it should be done on tissue, not on the blood. So PIK3CA usually done on the blood, but we have to do on the tissue testing for the PIK3CA, that has a role in aspirin for the further.
So before starting your treatment, you want this information, or you want this information after surgical specimen?
No, I want upfront, because if MSI high, the role of neoadjuvant immunotherapy is strongly proven and it is recommended right now. If we don't have any data, we will end up with chemotherapy and RT, and that is not going to help the patient. We will miss that patient.
So normally, routinely, we don't get this MSI testing in upfront way. Obviously, it is now upcoming and we should do. Meher sir, in your clinical practice, or all of you, do you people are getting that report upfront, or you get it later on, particularly in metastatic setting? Most of the people are getting it done. But how much you are getting it done in upfront setting?
Even though we ask for it, most of the times half the treatment is gone. We get the reports by that time, probably 2 weeks at least.
So I think right now MSI testing is done on ISC. And it's not a very costly test. It's not a very costly test.
ISC, without ISC we are not doing.
No, I think the
molecular
lagging is our side.
Yeah.
Lagging is side of the clinicians, because they are not asking to pathologists for these things. So
And
I just want to make.
some institutions, they are incorporating the report with the histopathology that MSI reporting.
Yeah.
Now that's gradually.
It is integrated inside this.
That's how you can change the protocol.
So now this patient, what do you prefer? Obviously this patient doesn't have MSI initially, and does it is going to change your protocol of treatment if you are going to give me neoadjuvant treatment? Is there any difference in your neoadjuvant treatment with this missing information or not? Yeah, MSI and
I will not choose any chemo, any radiation. I will go for only neoadjuvant immunotherapy. Preferred, if patient is able to do that. Because if it has been seen in the 10 patient only that dostarlimab drug was there, 100% PCR rate was there, and that was longer follow-up. So no need of any treatment. So definitely, if not, then I have to end up no treatment change.
so you may ask for the repeat colonoscopy and biopsy in this patient.
No, biopsy is already there, I think.
If tissue is not sufficient, then you may require. You think? Okay. So what is the modality now you people are going to choose this T3N1 young 30-year-old female?
So now, I think in MDT discussion, you had mentioned surgeon has to involve, surgeon has to counsel what would be the planned procedure after the surgery to the patient. The radiation part to be done by the radiation part.
So, sir, on which basis you decide that whether you have to give the long course RT or you are going to choose for the short course RT, particularly this patient?
I think early stage diseases, there is no extra mesorectal involvement, nodal burden is not very high, even in N1 some patients do not do. So basically even less than T3, basically we actually take it into picture into short course RT as the most important modality.
Okay.
First of all, I'd say hesitant to long course versus short course. Yes, you can add to that, but probably I will send it for divergence from our before.
So, So this patient got the proper long course RT. And now in the
They have only added benefit to the patient, to the surgeons, to the completion of the compliance of the treatment. Post PCR is okay, but the major problem is the completion of whole treatment in the TNT approach is more rather than the surgery followed by
this patient got this treatments. We are running little late with time. So overall, obviously, we have more advantage of PCR. So when you are going to choose the patient for observation, then obviously TNT approaches are much better than your conventional approaches. So this patient has gone for the conventional and just discuss later. So we have done this LAR after that and with covering stoma. Most of the patient in mid rectum or lower rectum, if they are radiated, we normally go with the LAR with the covering stomas. So now one approach is, if you have any kind of insight about the wait and watch approaches where patient want a organ preservation, what is your take? Is it actually we are practicing in India or just we are discussing it?
I think the surgeon should be able to answer it better, because usually after 6 weeks, once the treatment is done, we get the MRI, or probably if you look into the other trials, some say it is at 8 weeks. You can get it, or you can delay it by 12 weeks. So it all depends upon what is the initial assessment, what is the follow-up, how you want to do. I think it's more of a surgical.
So even in UK study, if you adenocarcinoma post TNT, they had nearly 20% patient. Even at 28 weeks, they had no disease. So those kind of cohort is now coming for wait and watch, where we can advise them organ preservation and particularly low volume disease. Obviously, heavy volume disease we are not preferring it, but it may possible.
Actually, we have adenocarcinoma, and adenocarcinoma respond later. They may respond 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. And also there is a case of Nancy Voltage, twice Nancy in the patient with with eye.
Yes. So overall, this patient is doing still fine. We have the.
I don't know how many centers are practicing it.
after RT and surgery.
And surgery. No, before the interval chemo, we are just doing 2 more cycles.
No, after surgery, the remaining
No,
chemo
after
is-
surgery it is there. Like, so TNT interval is not there.
I have not practiced.
Gap of 16 to 18 weeks. So during that time,
I think 16 to 18 weeks is pretty long gap. I'm not very sure about that. But then if it,
done more than 40 to 50 cases, he wanted specifically 2 cycles.
But sir, normally we prefer to go with the completion of the treatment before surgery, and then we prefer to go in between chemotherapy. We don't prefer.
I mean, the previous cycles, I think we'll come out with that very soon.
Sure. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thanks to the panelists and thanks to the persons.
Thank you. On the stage.
Wait, sir, wait, sir.
After this event, you can come out.
Dr. Karul Kambos.
Look here, sir.
Dr. Rahat Hari sir. Ma'am,
Wait, sir, look here.
please.
Wait, sir. No, sir. Look here इस कैमरे में सारे लोग लेके दो
आ रहे हैं ओ
वेट सर लुकिए सर कैमरे में
adult. The 50% is contributed in the pelvis and the lower lumbar vertebra. So pelvic bone marrow is a critical organ at risk in the pelvic radiotherapy. And what opportunity does IMRT gives us? It reduces the dose to the normal tissue compared to the 3D CRT. It allows dedicated pelvic bone marrow sparing optimization, and also there are mixed results in the literature due to the heterogeneity in the approaches considering the pelvic bone marrow as a constraint. Coming to the aims and objective, my primary endpoint was the dosimetric, where the pelvic bone marrow constraint, we have seen that both the low dose to the high dose lesion, comparing both with the pelvic bone marrow was a constraint and where it was not, and also considering the mean pelvic bone marrow dose. Clinical, we saw the acute hematological toxicities. We considered CTCAE version 5 for comparative toxicities. And we had some secondary endpoints also like target coverage and conformity, OAR dose parameters, and treatment schedule adherence. We considered the biopsy-proven squamous cell carcinoma, and it considered the 1B2 to 4A stage, and we had 25 patients in each arm, and it was considered by 1:1 randomization. We gave 50 grade 25 fraction PABRT, and we gave the weekly dose of concurrent cisplatin as 35 to 40 grade, and we did not increase more than 60 grade per week, and we then considered for the break-in therapy. And we had an image guidance, daily KVHG and weekly CBCT. It was institutional ethical approval was obtained, and planners were unblinded because they got the previous pelvic bone marrow objectives, but treatment clinician and toxicity assessments were blinded. These were my inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria. And what we did, we followed the 2-minute bladder protocol. We asked the patient to have 500 ml of water 30 minutes before the CT, and then rectum emptying. We considered that the rectum is not more than 4 centimeters prior to CT simulation. And we had the patient positioning was fine with the hemoplastic devices. And we gave IV contrast, and it was controlled as per the literature review given by the PGI Chandigarh guidelines. And our ORRs were small bowel bladder, rectum, femoral hair, spinal canal. Since we did not have any functional PET-CT like 5-fluorothiamidine, so we considered the whole bone, the pelvis bone, as a OAR. And these are some prescriptions that we have discussed and the constraints. We followed 2 tailored pair tests to compare the dosimetric parameters, and the Mann-Whitney U test to compare the clinical toxicity outcomes. So what results did we get? We found that there was no significant difference in the conformity index and heterogeneity values between the 2 groups, which indicated that we had the excellent target coverage which was achieved in both groups, and there was accepted bone marrow constraint and did not compromise the target coverage. What we also found is that the significant pelvic bone marrow reduction was there with the pelvic mean, considering the mean doses in the bone marrow MRT, and the lumbosacral spine, if we see this, it was the p-value was significant. And we had 4.27 grade reduction in the mean pelvic bone marrow dose, and 6% absolute reduction in the volume 20 grade dose. And all the pelvic bone marrow dose volume metrics were lower in the bone marrow MRT group. And we had the comparative oral dose of both both the arms, and the objectives did not increase the doses to the other critical organs. So the dosimetric impact we had the absolute reduction of 6 to 8% and 5 reduction in the mean pelvic bone marrow dose, and the results aligned with the dose response modeling in NTCP curve. And what we had the reduced acute hematological toxicities, improved target treatment adherence, and there was no compromise in the target coverage. And if you see the literature, some of the studies is aligned with what we reported. The findings as were consistent with the Bell et al. Intertech 2. And the Sturzer et al. It also recommended the pelvic bone marrow with V volume receiving 10% was less than 90-95%, and V20 is less than 65-86%, which was consistent with our results also. But we had certain limitations also, since it was a single center trial and we have just focused on the osteotoxicity, we would not have the long-term marrow recovery doses, we don't have the late hematopoietic effects also, and we did not have the survival outcome. And controlling method also, we did not consider any functional imaging, and so we maybe would have included some inactive bones also. And the planning objectives were, there was optimal constraints which requires refinement if we are considering a large study and we are planning for the multi-centric trials of those studies. And exact those volume threshold cutoffs, it needs validation. For this, we need to consider it for the larger trials. So what I conclude is that there is substantial lower marrow dose in the devious parameters. There is significantly reduced acute hematologic toxicities. So pelvic bone marrow should be considered as one of the more organ at risk. Thank you.
Where did the dose actually increase? Did you find any increase in the bladder or the bowel?
Basically, the majority of patients were, up to 3C2, 3C1, the pelvic bone involvement. So we do not get such consideration where it was more in the bladder or the doses were increased. So we did not get that in our study. Thank you so much.
Dr. Aram, have you given PRV margin for the bone marrow when you are doing that?
So, we did get that here.
1 mm, 2 mm?
So 1 mm.
Okay, and your image guidance for planar imaging or volumetric imaging?
So volumetric we did for the weekly and daily we did the KV imaging. Thanks.
Now I request Dr. Alauddin Ansari to please present his presentation.
Good morning, everyone. My topic is the 10-year audit of male breast cancer. And as we know, the male breast cancer is the rare disease, and the incidence rate is less than or equals to 1% of the all breast cancer which occurs. And due to its rarity, there is significant gap in the understanding the pathophysiology of the breast cancer. As we know that the female breast cancer is prevalent one, and we know very well about the pathophysiology and biology of the disease, and we treat accordingly. Because treating any cancer, we need to know the pathophysiology of the disease. And the treatment protocol of the breast cancer is majorly derived from the female breast cancer. And in this study, we tried to find out what is the demographic treatment protocols and survival in the Indian male breast cancer patients, because there are very few literatures which describe the male breast cancer patients in Indian scenario. Aim of this study is to provide a more comprehensive understanding of male breast cancer, its behavior, treatment outcomes, and in academic settings. 42 male breast cancer patients were registered, in between 2014 to 2024 in our department, and we retrospectively studied these patients. And the data is mainly focused on the patient demographics, tumor characteristics, treatment modalities, and survival outcome. And the data was collected from the case record sheet and the hospital information system. This is the characteristic of the male breast cancer patients. Like the median age of the presentation was 58 years old, and that vary between the 28 to 83 years old. And the most common are the right-sided. And coming to the histology, most of the patients, that is 88% were IDC, and 12% patients are other histologies. And in the grade, the highest were grade 2 patients, followed by grade 3, that was 21%, followed by grade 1 disease. And most of these patients are estrogen receptor positive. And PR positivity was 69%, HER2 was 14%, which was around equal to the female breast cancer patients. And we also have 7% incidence of TNBC breast cancers. Coming to the stage-wise presentation, most common presentation was stage 3 disease, followed by stage 2, which were 21%, followed by stage 1, that is 11% of the patient, 10% presented with the metastatic disease. Out of these all patients, the patients who underwent MRM are like 70% patients, and all the patients who underwent MRM who are gone sentinel lymph node biopsy. There are no patient who underwent. All patients who are underwent axial lymph node dissection. No patient were undergone sentinel lymph node biopsy. Most of the patients received either neoadjuvant or adjuvant chemotherapy. Like 70% of patients received chemotherapy in any form, like either neoadjuvant, adjuvant. PMRT was given in 60% of patients, while palliative RD was given in only 12% of patients. Adjuvant hormonal treatment was started in 65% of the patients, while 60% were given tamoxifen, which has higher evidence. Coming to the survival analysis, the 5-year median OS was 5-year median OS was 6.7 years, while 5-year OS was 57% in our patient cohort, while the median PFS was 55 months, while 5-year PFS was 46 months. Coming to the stage-wise median survival, in stage 1 the median was not reached, while in stage 2 the median survival was 81 months, in stage 3 it was 77 months, in stage 4 it was 29 months. Coming to the Kaplan-Meier analysis of the stage-wise survival, in stage 1 it was around 75%, there was 5%, out of which 4 was still alive, 1 succumbed to death. And in stage 2, the 5-year OS was 56%, while in stage 3 it was 59%, in stage 4 it was 37%. Coming to the discussion in comparison with the other literature, there is latest study which was published by Ajay et al. In 2025. In the Chicago, they reviewed 21-year data from their database, and they found that 81 patients were there, and their survival, 5-year overall survival was like 63%, and stage-wise survival was, stage 1 is 86%, stage 2 64%, while stage 3 42%, and stage 4 is 14%. And there is one very good Indian study, that is Soni et al., that is the PGIS Rohtak. They have around 100 patients, and they did 30-year audit, and their median OS was 78 months. And in our study, the median OS was 81 months. That is in line with the other studies, either in the Indian subcontinent or it is done outside the country, like the studies done in the US. And in our study, the stage-wise survival matched with the study done in the Chicago by Ajay et al. So the result is in line with the other studies, but the problem is that there is no randomized trial in this site, and they are highly unlikely that the randomized trial would be done due to the rarity of disease. And the projected incidence of breast cancer in 2025 is around 250,000, and 1% of that is about 2,500. To do any randomized trial, we have to make our registry data very strong, robust, and do collaborative study. Coming to the conclusion, the
we register approx 4 cases in a year at its own percent, and we have little bit higher hormone receptor positive cases in our department, and the male breast cancer are treated on the line of the female breast cancer, and the treatment of male breast cancer are still evolving. And there are various unanswered questions because there are no randomized trial yet in this field. So the survival outcomes are comparable, but there is need to understand the MBC biology and there is need for the personalized treatment to further improve the outcome. Thank you.
Any questions from the floor? All the cases were MRM. So, do you find any dosimetry planning difference between a male breast volume versus a female breast MRM volume?
MRM volume, like sir, there was little bit increase. That is not the significant difference, but there was little increase in the lung dose.
I was thinking from a physics point of view, maybe the volumes will be lesser in the male compared to a female MRM cases. Is it? I was thinking the volume of the PTV for MRM in a male breast versus a female may be a little different.
Yes, sir, maybe little different because the shape of the chest wall.
Yeah.
In the female, there is slope of the chest wall and the slanting contour of the chest wall might be different in the male and female. We have to see the dosimetric analysis.
Okay.
Yes.
Because it will have dosimetric
Yes,
implications.
we have to look in that aspect also. There is any difference in the dosing of the lung dose or any hard dose difference because of the slanting or the contour of the chest wall. Yeah, that is the.
So male breast may result in a better heart lung spreading.
Yes, better heart and lung spreading.
Thank you.
Miss Anu Roy, please stand from our stage.
Good afternoon everyone. I am here to present my study, Asymmetrical PTV margin calculation for craniospinal irradiation and institutional study. Craniospinal irradiation clinical outcomes are highly depends on patient position reproducibility due to the complexity of the techniques used. Translational displacement is site-specific from brain to lower spine in CSI treatment. So, cerebral margin for CTV also has to be applied site-specific to reduce normal tissue complications. But institutional protocols which does not have daily imaging will have difficulty in optimizing setup error margin. The aim of my study is to analyze the setup errors in craniospinal irradiation cases treated using the IMRT technique and to calculate the optimal planning target volume margin from the measured setup errors to ensure adequate target coverage. This study was a retrospective study with 6 CSI patients treated on variant TrueBeam linear accelerator version 2.7. CT simulation was performed with 3 mm slice thickness and the DICOM images were imported into Eclipse TPS version 13.6. The targets and the ORs were contoured as per ICRU and RTOG guidelines with institutional PTV margin protocol of 7 mm. Coming to the treatment planning, the technique we have used is overlap junction IMRT with energy of 6 MV photon beams. The beam arrangement has been shown there pictorially with equally spaced 7 beams for cranial target and 1 posterior and 2 posterior oblique beams for the spine. divided into brain, middle spine and lower spine. Daily setup verification was done using 2D KV imaging using body landmarks, and the setup errors were measured in 3 translational axes, lateral, vertical and longitudinal. The systematic and random errors were calculated, and from this the PTV margin is obtained as per ICRU report 62 recommendations. The equation which I have used for margin calculation is given in the slide. The results are tabulated, and from the setup error it is seen that the translational displacement saw a